So good morning, everyone. Trying to see the last. Good. So now that I know that you can hear me and see the screen, we're going to start with the webinar. Good morning. My name is Juan Miguel Velásquez. I'm an associate at the Research and Practice team here at EMBARQ. I worked in a report with several other colleagues on the social, environmental, and economic impacts of bus rapid transit, which I will be presenting today to you. So the report was commissioned by HSBC and was done by a team of researchers here at EMBARQ. You can see more about the report on our website. The presentation will be shared by the Center of Excellence, so you can get the link to download the report. But to introduce the report and the project in which we worked, I'm going to show a little video just describing, giving a general overview of what the project was and some of the findings that we had. So.
Istanbul and Mexico City are two congested cities. There was no solution. There was a negative cycle in which both cities said there's no money for major investments, so we stay like that. Metrobus proved that these systems can attract big crowds with a good quality of service, that demand is attractive to the private sector.
Once Metrobus was introduced, all of a sudden we had, the restaurants started to come back to Gentes, people started walking on the sidewalks, the street became more alive.
Es una alternativa más que puede contribuir a que la gente se mueva más rápido, a que vaya de una forma más cómoda, más eficiente, más segura y pueda tener esta alternativa para poder contribuir a su movilidad.
Un problema que hay en la ciudad es esta cantidad excesiva de automóviles, por lo tanto, pues las emisiones y los tiempos que dedica la gente para hacer estos recorridos es muy grande.
In order to improve the air quality in a city, you have to act on transport. And by that I mean you have to reduce the use of private vehicles and increase the use of public transport. The Metrobus in Mexico, it's healthier because it tends to be there less time, so the exposure to pollutants is reduced.
Metrobus introduce los autobuses de bajas emisiones, introduce los sistemas inteligentes, introduce la tarjeta de recaudo.
In Metrobus, we have around 900,000 people being transported every day. Not only because they have to use it, sometimes it's also because they decide to use it, which is very important.
El sistema lo uso bastante, ya que es un medio que me lleva rápidamente a los lugares donde yo quiero ir.
Es cómodo, es seguro y es rápido.
Lo que se ha visto en la aplicación y en el desarrollo de corredores BRT en términos de la seguridad vial es que hay una mejora muy importante. Se calcula que la reducción de accidentes en estos corredores es hasta del 80% después de la implantación.
Hoy es mucho más seguro caminar o cruzar en un corredor donde hay un Metrobús y la gente sabe dónde para, la gente sabe dónde está el paseo peatonal.
Cada vez vemos más bicicletas, cada vez vemos más personas que van al trabajo en transporte público. Yo creo que Metrobús ha sido uno de los proyectos que le ha cambiado la cara a la ciudad.
Istanbul Metrobus is 52 kilometers with 42 stations and fully dedicated single continuous line. We carry 750,000 people in a day.
Through the BRT system in Istanbul, people save 2 and 8 days over the course of a year. So we can say that they receive theirs everywhere back.
As you can imagine, with a city of about 15 million, it's really hard to get around with cars. To cross the bridge from Asia to Europe, with car it would take 1.5 hours. With Metrobus it's only like 15 minutes.
When the BRT was introduced, accident numbers fell with between 30 and 40%. So this is a huge saving in accidents. It's a huge saving in money terms as well.
In the first phase of Metrobus, over 20,000 cars were removed from the road. More than 600 tons of carbon emissions are reduced.
The BRT has a big advantage that it's a relatively cheap option for a mass transport system.
Other transit systems are not as widely used or well perceived as Metrobus. I think the city is in a new era.
So now that you got a better idea of what the report is, and you must have realized that we analyzed 4 cities in the report, namely Mexico City, the Line 3 of Metrobus in Mexico City, Metrobus, the BRT system in Istanbul in Turkey. We analyzed phases 1 and 2 of Transmilenio in Bogota, Colombia. And lastly, we analyzed the Rea Vaya system in Johannesburg in South Africa. So those were the 4 case studies that we used. But from the beginning, the report also tried to give a perspective on what was BRT and how BRT has been evolving around the world. So as some of you know, BRT had its origins in Latin American cities in the 70s. And it was a fairly slow take-up during the past, between the 70s and 80s and 90s. There were very few new systems starting. Most of them were in Latin America. It was a slow take-up. And it wasn't until year 2000 when Bogota started the Transmilenio system when it really picked up and when the adoption of BRT system started becoming widespread, and it started also going outside the region of Latin America. And as you see, the growth of systems around the world is exponential after having 160 systems and by the end of 2013 all around the world, and mainly in developing cities around the world, in Asia, in Africa, and not just in South America, but in Central and North America as well. So it's a fast-growing adoption of BRTs around the world, and it happened in a much shorter time frame than it did for other systems like metro systems or other rail-based systems. BRTs also have a wide range of performance. When you look at the number of passengers transported by different BRTs, you reach almost 2 million people, like the case of Transmilenio in Bogota, or you have smaller systems of around 40,000 people a day, like the one in Johannesburg in South Africa. And in between, you have a wide range of different riderships, which you can understand that it's a technology that you can adapt to different situations and different types of requirements for every city. Likewise, the peak load, that's the number of passengers that ride the system in one direction within 1 hour. Transmilenio is one of the highest. It's probably also getting a bit problematic. It's about 48,000 passengers per hour per direction. It's a very high peak load, comparable to only very few metros in the world exceed this ridership. And again, in the middle, there's a wide range of riderships. So there's an overlap between some of what metros can do, what light rail can do, and what some bus technologies can do if you go to the systems with the lower peak load, like Janmarg in Ahmedabad and the BRT in Jinan in China. So there's also, it offers the flexibility to have stronger or lower capacity in your system so that you can carry different peak loads and adapt your system to what the cities need. In commercial speed, so BRTs can also have a wide range of commercial speed, but it is a rather high commercial speed if you look at the average of the systems, and in general it's comparable to what you can get in some metros in some cities. So it's also one of the advantages of BRTs that you can have high commercial speeds with buses. Obviously the highest commercial speeds you can get them in systems like Metrobus in Istanbul or the Transoeste in Rio de Janeiro in Brazil, where you have corridors. When you have buses running in corridors and expressways in the median of expressway without any intersections, without any traffic lights, and even with express routes in some cases where you have very high commercial speeds and very little stopping. That's not possible in every corridor of the city, so there's other systems that adapt more to corridors where you might have signalized junctions, or when you don't always have segregated and complete expressway like those two. And if you have lower requirements and corridors where you cannot support that kind of speeds, you can have lower speeds like the one that you can see in the systems in Jinan, China, or other systems where the type of technology that you implement is not as high, and the type of corridor is not the same as in the other. Same case with the capital cost per kilometer. There's a wide range, and it's obviously related to the past two slides. The higher the cost of the system, the more likely you are to have higher capacity to be able to carry more passengers and have a higher speed. And same with the low. So you have very low-cost systems like the ones in BRT the BRT in Jinan in China, where you have about $1 million per kilometer, and you have the cost of phases 1 and 2 in Transmilenio, which is the one that we studied for our case, which cost about $12.5 million, their capital cost of investment. So even the highest performing system has a fairly reasonable cost, and in between you have similar costs, and when you compare it with other technologies, it is really one of the advantages that you have with BRTs, the capital cost and the time frame in which you can implement a system is definitely lower than what you find with other types of mass transit technologies. So let's go a little bit of what are some of the impacts that you get from BRT systems, and obviously, travel time savings is one of the most important benefits that we found in throughout the evaluation that drives the benefits in the 4 cases that we analyzed. And this travel time savings are mainly a benefit of having segregated busways. So the BRT buses, as you can see in this picture of Rio de Janeiro, the BRT buses are going on their own lane. They're separated from congestion. They don't interact with other vehicles and are therefore able to travel at higher commercial speeds and enable people to save time when they travel. So, and also there's benefits of the travel can also be more reliable since it's not subject to congestion. Similarly, these systems tend to also have a high frequency of service, and therefore waiting times are lower. If the buses are coming with such high frequency, people have to wait very little for the next bus to come. In the case of Metrobus, we analyzed line 3 in Mexico City, and you can see that some of the lines in Metrobus have frequencies of over 60 buses per hour, meaning that you can get that the waiting time can be very, very low if you consider that there's that the time between each bus is less than 1 minute. So the waiting times are very low. That is key in driving travel time savings. There's also the segregation of the bus into its own separate lane, bypassing congestion, general city congestion, and that also is the main driver of travel time savings. But similarly, you also have You also have buses going that have elevated platforms to board the buses, and this prepaid. Usually, these stations are prepaid, so you pay before boarding, and you have high platforms where you can just enter the bus very easily, and that makes the stopping time and the dwelling time of the buses at stations very, very efficient. And that's another key driver in the productivity and in the travel time savings of bus rapid transit systems. Another key benefit of bus systems is definitely the reduction in emissions, greenhouse gas emissions, and local air pollution. Throughout the 4 cases, we saw that in both those cases, greenhouse gases and local air pollutions, we have significant reductions in those. The local air pollutants are definitely linked to health hazards among the population, including cardiovascular disease, respiratory system diseases, early deaths due to these diseases, and definitely reduction in the quality of life for the general population. And the 4 case studies showed significant improvement in terms of the air quality, and also in terms of the greenhouse gas emissions that are taken to the atmosphere. So if you look at the picture, this is a picture of Bogota. Some of the BRTs that we looked at are systems that replaced older systems like the one in the picture. So you're replacing a large fleet of older buses with newer buses that have probably new technologies, usually. So they're newer buses with newer technologies that are fuel efficient, that have the latest emissions control and meet the latest emission standards of the countries where they're being implemented, and replace older buses that are inefficient, that pollute a lot, that and also the number of the size of the fleet. You're usually replacing a large fleet with a smaller fleet as well. So all those factors add up to significant reductions in emissions and in greenhouse gas emissions. Similarly, there's also an additional smaller factors that add up into that. Usually systems have better driver training. That means the drivers are more likely to have eco-friendly driving cycles, which lead to lower fuel consumptions and therefore lower emissions in some of the systems. And that is obviously one of the key drivers of the benefits of BRT, and some of the things that policymakers and decision makers look into when they're deciding to build a BRT system. And there are significant road safety benefits when you're building BRT systems. So when you have the segregated bus lane and you have the bus and you separate mixed traffic from the bus traffic, you have a significant reduction in the number of interactions that both systems have with each other, and that is a key in driving a reduction in injuries and a reduction in fatalities. But there's other important things important factors that also sum to that, and it's as you saw in the previous picture. With the older buses, you're replacing a large fleet of older buses with a newer fleet of less buses, and that reduction in vehicle kilometers is as most of you know, or some of you may know, the risk of an accident is strongly correlated with the number of vehicle kilometers that you travel. When you reduce the number of vehicle kilometers traveled by the fleet in general, you're reducing the risk of accidents as well. And then in some, especially in the Latin American systems, you're also making very strong institutional changes where you're changing the incentives of drivers who before had on-street competition, and they're now part of an organized system where there is no competition, and therefore the incentive to go into dangerous travel behavior is not as strong as it was before, and that is key in driving the reduction in fatalities and in injuries of BRT systems around the world. And finally, and this is the reason why we have a picture of one of the Transoeste drivers, it's driver training. Drivers in BRT systems, because they're formal employees of the companies, they have formal driver training, they are evaluated, they comply with labor regulations in terms of how long they can work, the number of hours they can work, and the rest that they should have. And that is another key driver in the road safety benefits of bus rapid transit. And if you look at the Latin American context, for instance, we find that you can get a reduction of at least 40% of reduction in fatalities in the corridors where you implement bus rapid transit systems. So particularly road safety, BRTs are a key element in any road safety policy. So it's one of the instruments that authorities have at their reach to drive the reduction and to meet the goals in terms of fatality reduction and injury reduction that cities need to achieve. And road safety and in general organized public transport systems are a big tool, and it's probably the biggest and most powerful tool that cities have at their hand to reduce road safety. A very interesting benefit that we analyzed and that we included in our evaluation was the benefit of physical activity. So in most systems, we found that there's a positive effect on physical activity. People are more likely to walk when you implement BRT systems, and that's due to several reasons. The first one being that usually before, in the older bus systems, people used to have to walk longer. You used to walk shorter distances because the stops were closer to each other. The buses were constantly stopping, and people didn't have to walk as much as they did before. Now with the BRT systems, the stations are set apart a larger distance from each other than they were before, and despite that, there's obviously time savings because of the time in the station and in the vehicle reduced despite the longer walks. But that has a physical activity benefit and has, as you know, physical activity is important, and it has been classed as, we have been using the tool of the World Health Organization to assess what those benefits can be. So they come from people walking longer to stations. They also come from the fact that the BRT systems have attracted a portion of car users who were before less likely to walk, and now walk, even if comparatively to the car, it's a longer walk to the BRT station than they used to have when they use their private vehicle. So that's another driver in physical activity. And similarly, people who maybe took other bus routes now are attracted. There's new users to the BRT systems, and people are more willing to walk longer distances to BRT systems than they are to traditional bus systems. So that's the third factor that adds to the reduction in costs and the benefits that are derived from physical activity. In the case of Mexico City, for instance, which is the case that we'll present today, passengers walk an average additional of 3 minutes per day than they did previously. So those 3 minutes add up over a week and make people more likely to meet minimum physical activity standards recommended by health organizations around the world. And it's important. It's a benefit that is usually not included in most traditional cost-benefit analysis that you will see usually performed for these type of projects. Another impact that is very important of BRT systems, and it was not included in the socioeconomic evaluation that we did for methodological reasons. There's a debate and around that, but we certainly acknowledged and reviewed the evidence around the impacts that BRT systems have in land use. So this is a well-known case of Curitiba. As you can see, there's an impact that Curitiba had in terms of the land use and the urban development occurring around BRT stations, and therefore an increase in land values around stations. And there's case studies in Bogota, for instance, that show that density of the city increased around the Transmillennial corridors. And there's studies in Seoul, in Boston, and also in Bogota showing an increase in land values around BRT stations and due to the BRT investment. So BRTs are also an important tool to direct urban development. It's probably a tool that has not been explored and used to the extent that it should, but it is certainly a benefit that BRT systems have and that are important. So just to summarize, this will be in the presentation. We had travel time savings. We had reductions in greenhouse gas emissions and local air pollutants. We had improvement in road safeties that led to reductions in fatalities and injuries and crashes. We had the reduction in emissions obviously leads to reduced exposure to air pollutants and some of the health benefits of avoided respiratory disease and cardiovascular disease and that come through reduced emissions and reduced exposure to pollutants, and increased physical activity that we just mentioned. Similarly, we did a review of some of the land value impacts, and we only found one case, which was one of the several studies that was done in Bogota, where there was a reduction in the property value of residential properties. That usually probably has to do around the movement and the perceived deterioration of the built environment around stations, given increased traffic, crime that comes with increased traffic. But the evidence is not completely clear when you compare it to the rest, especially with commercial property values that have shown significant increases in Bogota and in other cities. So our methodology included going through the costs, which were planning and design, capital costs, including infrastructure, equipment, and some of the costs that we went through at the beginning of the presentation. Also, bus operations, maintenance, infrastructure maintenance, and in some of the cases, negotiations with existing transit operators. And the benefits, we already went through some of the benefits. The only additional benefit that you can see in this list is the changes in vehicle operating costs. So usually you see that some of the BRT systems replaced large old fleets of buses with smaller, newer fleets of buses that leads to a very significant reduction in the operating costs in fuel, labor, operating costs that you have to operate public transit. And that is one of the key benefits, especially in Latin American systems. But there's also, since you're reducing the number of buses and you're also improving the conditions for wider traffic and for private vehicles, and they also see a reduction in their operating costs. The four cases that we analyzed were Bogota, Mexico City, Johannesburg, and Istanbul, as I mentioned, and you will have in the presentation if you want to go into more detail before you dig into the report some of the characteristics of the systems. And now I want to just show some of the results that we had in the line 3 of Metrobus in Mexico City, and what were some of the numbers that we obtained in our report. So we included the planning costs of the system, infrastructure structure construction costs, equipment costs, so like acquisition of fleet, for installation of fare collection systems, the cost of maintaining the infrastructure and operating the buses, and the salvage value of fleet at the end was what we included in Mexico City. Land acquisition is not included given that no land was acquired for this particular line that we analyzed. It was included in the case of Bogota where there were portions of land acquired to build the system. And then some of the benefits that were included were changes in travel time, the reduction of operating costs for public transport, reduction in CO2 emissions, impacts due to road safety, health benefits of reduced exposure to local air pollutants, and the improvements in physical activity. So some of the costs, if we take the net present value at a discount rate of 12%, it's about $160 million. All the costs of the system, and then we valued the benefits. We did the traditional cost benefit analysis of the benefits, and we arrived to a benefit of about $200 million. So basically, there's a net benefit of about $40 million accrued to the investment in Line 3 in Metrobus in Mexico City. An easier way to see how the benefits are split among the different categories. You can see that reduced travel times are one of the biggest drivers, and that are the main reason why. If you have to point out a single reason, that would be the reason why BRT investments are successful. It's because they reduce the time that people use to travel. But there's also significant reductions in the cost of operating public transport vehicles. And similarly, road safety benefits are significant, and the number of lives that you're saving from road safety are very important and help justify an investment, and also help realize that it is a big benefit that you need to take into consideration. And so the benefit cost ratio was about 1.2. So for every dollar that the city of Mexico City invested in the BRT, the society as a whole received $1.22 in benefits, distributed as we saw in the previous slide. That also is an internal rate of return of 14%, which is higher than the opportunity cost of public funds. So we can conclude that it was a good investment of public funds and made sense. An additional analysis that we did for this and for all cases, which I find that is it's one of the innovations of this study, and is different from what you would see in most of these in most of the evaluations that people carry out for BRT systems. And the rationale behind doing a distributional analysis is that we need to include new metrics to understand and capture other effects of transport investments. And in this case, we wanted to include and see what were the equity, some of the equity benefits of investing in BRT. So we decided to split the cost benefit ratio by income quintile. So dividing the population that is benefited from BRT in 5 different groups, and we can see that the group with the second lowest income quintile was the group that benefited the most from the investment. Their cost benefit ratio was 2.35. So for every dollar that people in that quintile group paid to build the system and to operate the system, they receive $2.35 of the benefit. And similarly, both the lowest income group and the middle income group, they all have a cost-benefit ratio higher than 1, meaning that middle and lower income groups benefit significantly from BRT investment, and that there is a distributional effect, and that investment in BRT is progressive. We did this throughout the 4 cases, and I'll go by a summary of the results of the 4 cases. And similarly, the 2 highest income quintiles are, in the case of Mexico City, the population groups that contribute most to the tax base, and are therefore more likely to be the ones bearing the cost of the investment on the BRT, and are therefore have higher costs than they benefit. Similarly, higher income groups are the ones that are less likely to be using public transport systems. So that is something that public transport around the developing world needs to address, is how can we attract all income groups, and how can we attract them to use public transport. So part of this is they pay a larger amount of the taxes, but part of it is they make up a lower portion of the users of mass transit. So this is another tool that we can use to assess the benefits of transport investments, and I think one of the key innovations in this study. And there's other methodologies being developed elsewhere to assess equity, but it's important that we move from just traditional cost-benefit analysis, but that we also include these equity issues that are key in sustainability, and are key issues when it comes to communicating the benefits to policymakers, and there are also key issues when you're addressing development in general around cities in the developing world. So to summarize the case studies, we had very high benefits, and all benefit cost ratios were higher than 1, and very, very good social internal rate of returns. The case of Metrobus in Istanbul was particularly beneficial. That was they have very, very, very high travel time savings given the commercial speed of about 40 kilometers per hour, and that is the biggest driver in the benefits of the Metrobus in Istanbul, and that makes it stand out compared to the rest of the cases. But all the other cases have very good benefit cost ratio and social internal rate of returns. It's also important to compare them with each other. It's one of the contributions of this report, is that they were all measured with the same rules. They use the same rate of discount. They use the same logic behind calculating the benefits, and it makes them comparable throughout the cases and throughout the different cities, which is another contribution of the report. It's not an isolated case, but it's 4 cases of around the different regions of the world, portraying and appraising some of the benefits of BRT. And this is the summary of the distribution analysis of the cases. So divided again by income quintiles. You can see that in general the case of Mexico City is similar in other cities, where it's the second income quintile that receives most of the benefits, and the highest income quintile that has most of the cost. The case of Reavaya in Johannesburg is slightly different. It's the 4th income quintile, so the upper middle class that receives most of the benefit. That has to do with the trajectory and the location of the stations, but also the type of service that it replaced, and the taxi collective taxi service that it replaced was a service that catered to this income group. And similarly, there's an issue to address with the lowest income groups, and that's why this type of analysis is very important. Even though we're serving the second lowest income group, the lowest income group is being priced out of using BRT around the world, and that is an issue that needs to be addressed, not just with the trajectory and the location of the infrastructure and making sure that we have routes that cover those areas, but also making sure that our system is addressing their needs and that they are not priced out, and that our systems are not so expensive that we are not being able to attract the lowest income users. So let's go to the questions. You can ask some of the authors. We are available by email if you have any questions. And now I'm going to open the question panel on the webinar. So we are open to questions right now. Please, I will read them out loud, although I think you can see some of them probably in your screen. So I have a question from Darío Hidalgo. He's asking why the lowest income group benefit cost is lower than the second quintile. Is that an issue? What can be done? So that's similar to what I was mentioning before, and it's a question exactly of what can we do to address the accessibility issue of the lowest income quintile. So I think a small part of it is locating the services, making sure feeder routes are properly feeding and that we're serving those particular income groups. If you look at informal transport in some of these cities, informal transport is filling in a niche that is not being filled in by regular formal public transport, and it not just due to cost, but also because of the type of services that are being provided. So maybe BRT systems need to address that issue better of the type of services that we are providing there. But probably the biggest reason why they're not using the system as much is because they're being priced out of the system. And that's a big question of should we make subsidies that are available to anyone, like in many cities in the developed world, or should we have targeted subsidies? And I think technologies, fare collection technologies that we have in BRT systems are a very good method of targeting subsidies so that we can target specific groups of students and work with education departments, for instance, to target low-income students, for instance, or work with other subsidies that already work well, targeted subsidies, to be able to add transportation benefits instead of addressing the whole population. So I have another question. After the subsidies, it's about why is the Istanbul lowest income group red. It's red because the red signifies what is the group that benefited the least from the system. If you look, usually the one that benefits the least is the highest income quintile. In the case of Istanbul, it was the lowest. They still had a very large positive benefit, but since again, we have the same issue as in the rest of the systems, they are the ones who have the least benefits. In the case of Istanbul, higher income groups actually had a higher benefit and the system has been able to attract that kind of user as well. So it's a very, very different than the rest, a different case, but that's why it is shown in red. So I'm being asked about why we chose the discount rate, and was the same discount rate really appropriate for 4 quite different economies? So that's a good question. That's something that we address. We used a 12% discount rate for all the projects. We based it mainly on World Bank recommendations to use that number. However, it's not presented here, but you can look at the report, and the report contains a sensitivity analysis to see how much the benefits varied if we changed some of the parameters in the system. So we played around with different discount rates and found that the results were consistent with lower discount rates, especially in the case of Johannesburg. In South Africa, the recommendation is to use 7 or 8% discount rate, and we found that the results are consistent even at those discount rate levels throughout all the cases. So even though it's not the main choice for the main results, it is included in a sensitivity analysis and the report. Being asked about were there any economic impacts from lost employment opportunities to drivers in the previous transport schemes? I am assuming that there would be a reduction in the amount of employment in the sector through formalization. So yes, there is certainly jobs that are being replaced, but it's in a way it's in traditional cost-benefit analysis that's not necessarily a direct benefit or a direct cost of implementing the system. Some jobs were created and some were destroyed. In fact, formal jobs are actually jobs that contribute to social security systems and that pay taxes. And formal transit companies, when compared to informal transit companies, they contribute to the tax base as well. But since those are transfers within the economy, money that goes from one pocket of society to another pocket, they're not captured in traditional cost-benefit analysis. However, they are, if you go through the report, they are documented and they are mentioned throughout the report. So we have a comment from Clayton. Income redistribution seems to be the driving net benefit for the lowest income group. We might see the same effect for highways, schools, power plants. Not clear whether this is really an impact of BRT in particular. I think that it actually is maybe not of BRT, but income redistribution does seem to be an impact of mass transit investment more than other investments, in the sense that not everyone necessarily uses highways or uses all state investments, but mass transit is particularly used by lower income groups. And yes, the shape of the distribution is very dependent on the tax system and the people who contribute to this tax system in every country. So it's not only an effect of BRT, but also an effect of the general tax system. But I think part of the distributional analysis value is in identifying why we're not distributing more to the lowest income groups. And I think as a tool, it's a tool that helps us identify if we're failing in that, in having a even wider distributional effect. So we have a question: increase in physical activity is desirable, but if stations are kept farther, will they not make it difficult to take a bus, especially in bad weather? Yeah, that might be a consideration for a large number of cities, bad weather. But that's also a consideration with all mass transit. I don't think it's a particular problem of BRT, and there is a big trade-off between the distance between stations and the accessibility that you give. So distance allows you to provide higher operation speeds, distance between stations, so the buses are not stopping every single second. However, you are giving up a little bit of access because it's the station what gives access to the surrounding area, not the corridor. So there is a trade-off that has to be done, and each city has to find its correct balance so that that's not a problem. So we have a question from Ramon Munoz Raskin from Bolivia, from IDB. So what are some of the non-user benefits associated with BRT projects? So there are definitely traffic improvements when you're separating bus traffic into its own lane, and when you're reducing the number of older buses circulating. There are benefits that accrue to all the city, to private transport users, but also to the whole transport network in general, not just the corridor. And they were captured in some of the cases to the extent where data allowed it. But reduction in greenhouse gases is another key global benefit, not just even in the same city, but it's a global benefit when you have reductions in greenhouse gas emissions. Similarly, air pollution affects everyone who lives around the corridor where the BRT was implemented, and not just the users. So that's another key element. And I would also say that actually road safety affects mainly non-users, because the impact of accidents for bus users is usually low, like the level of injuries and the number of fatalities of people who are riding the bus is actually low, and it really, the victims of the accidents are the ones who are crossing the street, or the cars that conflict with buses and get into accidents. So I would say that road safety is mainly a non-user benefit of BRT. So there's another question about the air quality benefits, and were those improvements actually measured in terms of ambient air quality improvement, or if inferred from different technical standards of the enhanced public transport fleet? So what we did in most of the cases, and I'm assuming you are referring to local air pollutions, is we calculated the reduction in specific pollutants, and reduction given the lower number of kilometers that are being operated and the lower emission factors of new technologies, and compared it with the data that we'd had from the baseline information before the BRT was implemented. When we had the data, specifically I'm talking about the case of Line 3 in Transmilenio, which in Mexico City, which is the case that for which I showed numbers. And we linked those reductions in emissions to health benefits, mainly avoided cases of bronchitis, or number of work days that were not lost, and also premature fatalities due to respiratory disease, given the reduction in specific pollutants and specific local air pollution. So I have a question from Alvaro Guzman. Did you look at the benefits outside of the immediate corridor? How is accessibility addressed in the wider catchment area? So we didn't look specifically at accessibility benefits, and I agree that that is a key factor that should be included in wider transport evaluations when decisions are being made to invest in systems, but also after the systems are implemented to evaluate their success. It was outside of the scope of the report. It was mentioned and addressed, but it was not numerically quantified in our approach. We did, however, include non-user benefits, as I mentioned before, and those are benefits that occur outside of the immediate corridor. So, for instance, road safety fatalities are not just road safety accidents that occur with public transport vehicles, but also road safety benefits that accrue along the intersections and along the corridor where the BRT was implemented. But specifically, accessibility was not a metric that was included in the study. What evidence does the study group have to prove that high fares are a primary reason that the lowest income group is not using a bus rapid transit? How does this factor compare to others, such as low-income workers being less likely to work outside of their immediate neighborhoods? Locations of BRT lines in geographic areas that benefit low-income residents? That's an excellent question. I do think we need to do more research on exactly why low-income groups are not using BRT. It was widely discussed among the experts that did the report, but also among the experts that reviewed the report, and there seemed to be consensus on that. That is a big reason. And I think for every city it is different. In the case of Mexico and Bogota, lower income workers actually do work very long distances and travel very long distances to get to work. So in those two cases, people, they do use public transport, and they try to use the cheapest public transport, even if the difference is longer and even if they have to take more time. They try to find other alternatives. They walk very long distances in order to save fares, to save money on the fares. So we do think that there is an accessibility, affordability issue in BRT with the lowest income groups. But I do agree that there is a need to produce and research more specific evidence in that regard. So I get a comment, and I will read it out loud. In response to the question about station spacing, it shouldn't be forgotten that in most of these cities, there are other local bus services available in the same neighborhoods as BRT stations. So if customers don't want to walk all the way to a BRT station, they likely have other options. So that's a comment. I agree with the comment. In most of these cities that might be the case, and part of why people walk more to the stations is also because people are more willing to do it, because they know that they will get a more reliable, faster, lower waiting service from the BRT than they would get with the traditional bus system, and are therefore more willing to walk longer distances. Same as what happened with metros and light rail. People are more likely to walk longer distances than they do for local buses that run with the mixed traffic. Alvar, can you clarify what do you mean? How different is the station space? Like, do you mean throughout the different cities that we analyzed, or? So it tends to have station spacing throughout the cities tends to be around 800 meters to a kilometer between stations. What does vary in some cities is the type of access. So in Phase 2 in Transmillennium Bogota in the Metrobus system, given that it's a segregated lane in the median of expressway, there tends to be longer distances to walk through pedestrian bridges or grade separated access for pedestrian, which add important distances for walking. But in general, station itself and the space between one station and the other tends to be fairly similar throughout the cases that we analyzed, between 800 meters and 1 kilometer. I would have to go into the particular data to get more details. Okay, thank you. I'm getting a thank you comment from a few folks. If there's any more questions, please, we can do one more question here. Please feel free to email me as well. Even if when you read the report and you have specific questions, you can email me. I'm available to answer any questions that you might, any additional questions that you might have. So, well, I thank you all for your time and for the large amount of questions. And again, I insist I'm available to address any other concerns or any comments or questions that you have now or that you might have after you read the report. Please feel free to share it with everyone and to use it for your own work. So thank you, everyone. I will end the webinar now.